The Mitsubishi A6M0 slid through 15,000 feet of Pacific sky with the confidence of a predator that had never known defeat. Its engine hummed at 260 knots. The pilot scanning the horizon through the optical gun sight mounted before his windscreen. Below him, 8 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers droned homeward in a loose defensive formation, their Wright Cyclone engines straining to carry them back to their carrier after a dawn strike. The Zero pilot eased his throttle forward, rolled his fighter into a descending turn, and prepared to attack what appeared to be the easiest kills of his career. He had no way of knowing that the slow, ungainly bombers below represented one of the most dangerous opponents his fighter would ever face, and that the next 3 minutes would redefine everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about air combat superiority. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The mathematics of aerial combat in 1942 should have made this encounter a slaughter. The Zero possessed a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour against the Dauntless maximum of 255. The Japanese fighter could climb at 2,900 feet per minute, while the American bomber managed just 1,500. In a turning fight, the Zero could complete a full 360-degree circle in under 20 seconds, nearly half the time required by the heavier, slower Dauntless. 2 20mm cannons and a pair of 7.7mm machine guns gave the Zero devastating firepower concentrated in the nose, aimed by the pilot's eye through a single gun sight. The Americans flew bombers armed only with 2 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns and a single flexible-mounted .30 caliber gun operated by a rear-seat radio man gunner who sat backward, exposed to the slipstream, watching the empty sky behind for exactly this kind of attack. Every quantifiable metric of fighter performance favored the Japanese pilot. Yet the outcome of encounters between Zeros and Dauntless bombers throughout 1942 and 1943 proved that air warfare answered to physics and tactics rather than specifications alone. The story of how these two aircraft aimed to meet in lethal combat above the Pacific began years before either machine drew first blood, in design offices separated by 6,000 miles of ocean and an unbridgeable gulf in military philosophy. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued specifications for a new carrier-based fighter to replace the aging Mitsubishi 5M. The requirements seemed impossible to reconcile. Maximum speed of at least 310 miles per hour, climbing to 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. Endurance of 6 to 8 hours with external fuel tanks, armed with 2 cannons and 2 machine guns, and maneuverability superior to any existing fighter. The Navy wanted an aircraft that could escort bombers to distant Chinese targets, fight its way through enemy fighters, and return home with fuel to spare. Most importantly, it had to operate from aircraft carriers, which meant reinforced landing gear, folding wings or minimal wingspan, and salt-resistant construction. These demands appeared mutually exclusive because every design choice involves compromise. Speed requires power and smooth surfaces. Maneuverability demands a lightweight and large control surfaces. Range needs fuel, which adds weight. Armament and ammunition add more weight. Carrier operations require structural strength, which adds even more weight. J.I.R. Horikoshi accepted the challenge at Mitsubishi with a clear understanding that only radical weight reduction could satisfy all requirements simultaneously. He assembled a team that approached the Zero as an exercise in controlled desperation, cutting weight from every component without regard to conventional margins of safety. They used extra super duralumin, an advanced aluminum-zinc alloy developed by Sumitomo Metal in 1935, for major structural members like wing spars. This material offered excellent strength power-to-weight ratios, but required careful handling during fabrication. Workers pierced lightning holes through every bracket and mounting point where stress analysis permitted. They used plywood backing to reinforce metal structures instead of heavier steel or aluminum doublers. The wings attached permanently to the fuselage rather than being easily removable, allowing lighter mounting fittings because assembly crews would never need to repeatedly disconnect and reconnect them. The detachable joints sat behind the cockpit, where the lighter tail section required less robust connections. Horikoshi positioned the engine close to the wings and cockpit rather than the conventional practice of mounting it farther forward, which shortened the fuselage and brought the power plant nearer the aircraft's center of gravity. This arrangement improved maneuverability by reducing the moment of inertia around the pitch axis, allowing the elevator to rotate the aircraft more quickly. Weight savings came from what the Zero did not carry as much as from lightweight construction. Horikoshi omitted armor protection for the pilot. He did not install self-sealing fuel tanks, which prevented punctured tanks from leaking fuel but added substantial weight. The radio equipment remained optional depending on mission requirements, saving additional pounds when communication seemed unnecessary. These decisions reflected Japanese naval aviation doctrine in the late 1930s, which emphasized offensive operations and accepted higher casualty rates in exchange for superior combat performance. The resulting aircraft weighed 5,555 pounds fully loaded in its 6M2 configuration, nearly 2,000 pounds, lighter than the Grumman F4F Wildcat it would face in. 1,942. Wing loading measured just 24.3 pounds per square foot, compared to the Wildcat's 28.6. The Zero could turn tighter, climb faster, and fly farther than any Allied fighter in service when war began. At low to moderate speeds, it dominated the Pacific sky through pure aerodynamic superiority. The Douglas SBD Dauntless emerged from entirely different requirements under completely different constraints. The United States Navy wanted a scout bomber for carrier operations, an aircraft that could locate enemy fleets, dive bomb them accurately, and defend itself during the return flight. Specifications issued in 1938 called for a two-seat aircraft with radio navigation equipment, long-range fuel tanks, a 1,000-pound bomb load, dive brakes for terminal velocity control during bombing runs, and defensive armament. Speed and maneuverability ranked far below reliability, structural strength, and bombing accuracy. Douglas engineer Ed Hyman led the design team that produced the XBT-2, which evolved into the SBD through refinements and Navy design changes. The resulting aircraft possessed qualities that seemed obsolete before Pearl Harbor, but would prove decisive in combat. It was rugged, stable, and could absorb tremendous punishment while continuing to fly. The Dauntless featured all-metal stress skin construction with flush riveting to reduce drag. Perforated split dive brakes mounted under the wings allowed the aircraft to dive at steep angles exceeding 70 degrees while maintaining a constant airspeed around 250 knots, giving the bombardier time to aim precisely. The dive brakes worked so effectively that pilots could adjust bombing angle mid-dive without the aircraft accelerating beyond control. This stability platform gave SBD bombardiers the highest accuracy rate of any dive bomber in the war. A Ryder 182 Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine produced 1,000 horsepower, turning a Hamilton Standard constant-speed propeller that could absorb the available power across a wide range of airspeeds. The pilot sat forward under a sliding canopy with excellent visibility. Behind him, separated by a common canopy frame, the radioman gunner manned a flexible Mount 30 caliber machine gun that could traverse across a wide arc covering the rear hemisphere. Two 50 caliber machine guns fired forward through the propeller arc, synchronized to avoid striking the blades. What made the Dauntless lethal in combat against fighters was not its performance envelope, but its structural integrity and defensive firepower. The airframe could withstand loads far exceeding normal flight operations. The Wright Cyclone kept running, despite battle damage that would destroy more temperamental engines. The fuel tanks incorporated crude self-sealing technology that limited leakage when punctured. Most crucially, the radio man gunner sat facing rearward with nothing to do except watch for enemy fighters and engage them with his gun. Unlike flexible gunners in large bombers who divided attention between multiple stations or specific engagement windows, the SBD rear gunner had one job continuously throughout the flight. The .30 caliber Browning could fire at attacking fighters from the moment they appeared until they broke off or crashed. SBD formations flying in mutually supporting positions could concentrate multiple rear guns on a single attacker, creating intersecting fields of fire that forced enemy pilots to approach through bullet streams regardless of attack angle. The contrast in design philosophy between the Zero and the Dauntless reflected deeper differences in how Japan and America approached war in 1941. Japanese doctrine emphasized decisive battle, fought by elite forces employing superior weapons. The Navy trained its pilots intensively, often for 3 years before assigning them to operational units. These aviators practiced dogfighting until they could exploit every nuance of their aircraft's performance envelope. They flew Zeros that sacrificed pilot protection and structural safety margins for combat performance advantages. The assumption was that superior skill in a superior fighter would allow Japanese pilots to destroy enemies before being hit themselves. This doctrine worked brilliantly in China, where Japanese aviators faced obsolete Soviet-designed fighters flown by poorly trained Chinese pilots. It worked at Pearl Harbor, where American aircraft never left the ground. It worked in the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, where Allied forces possessed inadequate numbers of obsolescent fighters. American doctrine distributed capability more evenly across larger numbers of adequately trained personnel flying robust equipment. The Navy commissioned pilots after approximately 18 months of training, expecting them to learn combat tactics in operational squadrons while executing real missions. American aircraft designs prioritize pilot survival and mission completion over maximum performance. Self-sealing tanks, armor plate, redundant systems, and structural strength allowed pilots to survive combat damage and return with intelligence, even if they could not achieve air superiority. The SBD embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was not the fastest bomber or the longest ranged or the most heavily armed, but it could find enemy ships, bomb them accurately, and bring its crew home despite fighter attacks and anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft served as a platform for two skilled crew members rather than as a performance vehicle for an elite pilot. These competing philosophies collided over the Coral Sea in May 1942, during the first carrier battle fought entirely by aircraft, without the opposing ships sighting each other. Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vitasa from Scouting Squadron 5 flew an SBD on patrol when 3 Zeros attacked him on May 8. The Japanese pilots expected an easy kill. Vitasa's bomber could not outrun them, could not outclimb them, could not outturn them. Standard fighter tactics called for a high side pass from astern, diving through the target's altitude while firing, then zooming back up, using the speed gained in the dive to regain altitude for another pass. The 3 Zeros began their attacks with this maneuver, diving in sequence toward the Dauntless, while Vitasa's radio man gunner, Frank Tallman, engaged them with his .30 caliber gun. Vitasa did something the Zero pilots did not anticipate. Instead of maintaining course while trying to evade, he turned into the attacking fighters, presenting a constantly changing deflection angle that complicated their gunnery. The SBD's tight turning radius at low speed combined with its dive brakes deployed to prevent speed buildup, allowed Vitasa to reverse direction quickly. Each Zero pilot found his target disappearing from his gun sight as the Dauntless turned harder than the fighter could follow without losing speed. More critically, Vitasa positioned his aircraft so that each attacking Zero had to pass close aboard, where Tolman's gun could engage at point-blank range. The Japanese pilots expected to make firing passes against a straight-flying target, not to fly through defensive fire at converging range. On the third pass, Vitasa judged the geometry correctly and triggered his forward-firing .50 caliber guns as a Zero crossed in front of him in a climbing turn. The heavy bullets tore through the fighter's unarmored fuselage and set it afire. The Zero fell away trailing smoke. Vitasa shot down 2 more in the extended engagement, becoming the only dive bomber pilot to score 3 aerial victories in a single combat. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 demonstrated what happened when SBD formations encountered Zeros under less favorable circumstances. 6 Zeros from the carrier, Hiryu intercepted 6 straggling SBDs, led by Lieutenant Charles Ware, returning from the strike that sank 4 Japanese carriers. The bombers had become separated from their formation due to damage and fuel concerns. The Zeros made their initial attacks from astern and above, following standard doctrine. Ware responded with an improvised defensive maneuver that transformed isolated bombers into a mutual support formation. He ordered the SBDs into a gentle arc, almost a circular pattern, keeping the Zeros on the outside of the curve. This geometry allowed all 6 rear gunners to fire at any Zero attempting to press an attack, creating a cone of overlapping fire that no fighter could penetrate without taking hits. The Japanese pilots made repeated passes, expending ammunition without scoring kills. 2 Zeros sustained sufficient damage from the concentrated defensive fire that they had to break off and return to Hiryu. 1 ditched in the ocean before reaching the carrier, and the other barely made it aboard. The remaining 4 Zeros eventually disengaged after exhausting their ammunition against targets that should have been defenseless. Aviation machinist, Mate 3rd Class Bruno Gato, flying as radioman gunner for Ensign Franco Flaherty, participated in this engagement. Gato had already distinguished himself in February when he leaped into a parked SBD on the Enterprise flight deck during a Japanese attack, manned its gun, and shot at a damaged bomber attempting to crash into the carrier. Admiral Halsey promoted him to 1st class on the spot. At Midway, Gato's accurate gunnery likely contributed to damaging 1 or both of the Zeros that had to withdraw. Unfortunately, O'Flaherty's aircraft had been holed during the fighter attacks and was losing fuel. He ditched in the ocean after the Zeros broke off. The Japanese destroyer Makigumo picked up both men, interrogated them, and eventually executed them by tying weights to their bodies and throwing them overboard. Neither man provided actionable intelligence, despite interrogation that almost certainly involved torture. These encounters revealed tactical principles that transformed Pacific air combat. The Zero's performance advantages meant nothing against targets that refused to fight a conventional dogfight. SBDs flying in formation could concentrate defensive fire that forced the Zero pilots to choose between pressing attacks, through bullet streams or breaking off before reaching effective gun range. Individual bombers could defeat fighters by turning toward attacks rather than away, disrupting attack geometry and forcing closure rates that prevented accurate shooting. The Zero's lack of armor meant that even .30 caliber bullets could inflict fatal damage when they hit critical components like the engine or fuel system. Most importantly, the SBD's structural strength allowed it to absorb hits that would destroy lighter aircraft. Zeros often scored hits without achieving kills because their cannon rounds passed through the Dauntless without striking vital structures or exploding against sufficiently resistant surfaces. The Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942 provided the most extensive test of Zero capabilities against dauntless formations when 20 Japanese fighters attacked American bomber groups heading toward Japanese carriers. The SBDs maintained tight defensive formations despite the overwhelming numerical odds. Rear gunners engaged every Zero that approached, forcing the Japanese fighters to execute quick firing passes rather than sustained tracking shots. The Zero shot down several bombers, but the majority survived to deliver their attacks and return to their carriers. Japanese fighter leaders noted with frustration that the dauntless formations proved nearly impossible to break up despite local numerical superiority. Individual stragglers fell quickly, but any bomber that maintained position in formation enjoyed overlapping defensive fire from multiple gunners. The technical specifications of both aircraft reveal why these tactical patterns emerged as they did. The Mitsubishi, a 6M20, measured 29 feet 9 inches in length with a wingspan of 39 feet 4 inches. Empty weight was 3,704 pounds, growing to 5,555 pounds when loaded with pilot fuel, ammunition, and equipment. The Nakajima NK-1 Sisake 12-cylinder radial engine generated 940 horsepower at takeoff, driving a 3-blade propeller that gave the Zero a maximum speed of 316 miles per hour at sea level and 331 at 14,930 feet. Service ceiling reached 33,000 feet. Range with internal fuel was approximately 1,160 miles, extending to 1,930 miles with a single external drop tank. Armament consisted of two Type 99 20mm cannons mounted in the wings outboard of the propeller arc, each with 60 rounds of ammunition, and two Type 97 7.7mm machine guns mounted above the engine cowling, each with 500 rounds. This armament concentrated in the nose meant that bullets converged at a point ahead of the aircraft, requiring only that the pilot place his gun sight on the target without calculating parallax corrections. The Douglas-3 Solomon Islands Dauntless, MESUR, a D-32 feet 8 inches in length with a wingspan of 41 feet 6 inches. Empty weight was 6,345 pounds, growing to 10,400 pounds, fully loaded with crew, fuel, ammunition, and a 1,000-pound bomb. The Ryder 182052 Cyclone 9-cylinder radial generated 1,000 horsepower at takeoff, turning a Hamilton standard constant-speed propeller that gave the Dauntless a maximum speed of 250 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. Cruise speed was 144 miles per hour, though combat formations typically flew closer to 180 to balance fuel consumption against tactical needs. Service ceiling reached 24,200 feet, lower than the Zero, but adequate for most Pacific combat which occurred below 20,000 feet. Range varied significantly based on bomb load and fuel configuration, reaching approximately 1,100 miles without bombs and with external tanks. Defensive armament consisted of two Browning M250 caliber machine guns mounted in the upper forward fuselage and synchronized to fire through the propeller, each with 360 rounds, plus twin Browning 30 caliber machine guns on a flexible mount operated by the rear gunner, with 2,000 rounds total. This armament split between forward-firing and rear-firing guns meant that only half the weapons could engage any single target, but the flexibility allowed defense against attacks from any angle. The performance comparison makes the Zero's advantages obvious in every category except ruggedness and firepower. A speed advantage of 80 miles per hour allows the fighter to dictate engagement terms, choosing when to attack and when to disengage while the slower bomber cannot escape or pursue. The climb rate advantage means the Zero reaches advantageous altitude first and can regain height faster after diving attacks. The range advantage allows Japanese fighters to escort strikes to distant targets, while American fighters of comparable performance lack the endurance to provide protection throughout long missions. The ceiling advantage gives Japanese pilots the option to dive from above with cumulative speed advantages that make interception difficult. By every measure of fighter capability, the Zero outclassed the Dauntless, yet combat outcomes depend on more than performance envelopes because engagements occur under specific circumstances that may neutralize advantages or create unexpected vulnerabilities. The Zero's speed advantage proved decisive in pursuit situations where the fighter chased a fleeing bomber, but pursuit required clear sky and sufficient separation between aircraft to accelerate. Information combat where bombers maintain mutual support. The Zero could not pursue any single target for the extended period needed to build maximum speed because other bombers' defensive fire forced the attacking pilot to maneuver defensively rather than maintaining pursuit geometry. The climb advantage proved decisive when Zeros needed to reach altitude quickly for interception or when regaining height after diving attacks. But it meant nothing during formation combat where relative altitude changed slowly and predictably. The range advantage proved strategically important but tactically irrelevant. Zero pilots escorting strikes to distant targets arrived over enemy positions with reduced fuel due to the long transit, which limited their time on station for combat air patrol. SBD formation striking targets knew they would return to their carrier immediately after bomb delivery, so they conserved no fuel for extended loitering. The typical engagement lasted minutes rather than hours, during which time fuel consumption made no difference to combat outcomes. The ceiling advantage mattered primarily for bomber interception, where high-altitude diving attacks built enormous speed that complicated defensive gunnery. Against SBD formations flying low-altitude missions, the Zero gained no advantage from operating at 30,000 feet because combat occurred at the bomber's altitude regardless of where the fighter began. The structural comparison favored the Dauntless dramatically despite the Zero's specification advantages. The American bomber incorporated safety margins throughout its design that allowed it to absorb punishment and continue flying. Wing spars used thick aluminum members with multiple load paths so that partial damage did not cause immediate failure. The fuselage structure employed a stressed skin design with closely spaced frames and stringers that distributed loads across the entire airframe. The landing gear could withstand heavy carrier landings at high sink rates, which required much stronger construction than land-based aircraft needed. The engine mounting used vibration-isolated supports that allowed the power plant to shake violently from battle damage without tearing loose from the airframe. The control surfaces incorporated mass balances and redundant linkages so that battle damage to one component did not make the aircraft uncontrollable. The Zero sacrificed these margins deliberately to achieve minimum weight. Wing spars used minimum gauge extra super duralumin size precisely for calculated loads with minimal excess strength. The fuselage structure employed widely spaced frames with large lightning holes that saved weight but concentrated stresses in fewer structural members. The landing gear was adequate for carrier operations, but possessed no margin for hard landings or side loads from battle damage affecting control. The engine mounted rigidly to the firewall, which saved weight but meant that any loosening of the mounting could tear the engine free during violent maneuvers. The control surfaces used the minimum structure needed for flight loads, which worked perfectly under normal conditions, but could be damaged easily by gunfire. These design philosophies manifested in combat to differential survival rates. SBD, crews shot up by Zeros, often returned to their carriers with dozens of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, wounded crew members, and failing engines. Yet the aircraft remained controllable and capable of landing. The robust structure absorbed damage without catastrophic failure. The redundant systems allowed continued operation despite partial failures. The powerful engine kept running despite damage that would stop more temperamental power plants. Zero pilots hit by defensive fire from SPDs experienced very different outcomes. Hits to the wing often cracked spars that failed under maneuvering loads, causing structural breakup. Hits to the fuselage often punctured fuel tanks that leaked gasoline into areas where ignition sources caused fires. Hits to the engine often destroyed cylinders completely, causing immediate power loss. The Zero either survived combat undamaged or suffered catastrophic failures with little middle ground. Zero pilots developed counter tactics as the war progressed. They learned to attack from ahead rather than astern, eliminating the rear gunner threat, but requiring precise deflection shooting against a low-speed target. They attempted diving attacks from extreme altitude, trading altitude for speed that let them streak past the formation before gunners could track them. But high-speed diving passes reduced time available for accurate shooting and often resulted in overshooting the target. Some pilots tried coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, hoping to divide the gunner's attention, but this required communication and timing that rarely worked in combat chaos. The most effective tactic proved to be patience, following the bombers until one sustained damage or consumed enough fuel to force it out of formation, then attacking the isolated aircraft. This approach won engagements but lost wars because it allowed American bombers to reach their targets, deliver their weapons, and retreat to safety, even when Japanese fighters eventually shot down stragglers. The relationship between the Zero and the Dauntless embodied a deeper truth about technological warfare. Superior performance specifications matter only within the tactical context where combat actually occurs. The Zero dominated traditional fighter versus fighter dogfighting because its lightweight, powerful controls, and excellent thrust-to-weight ratio allowed maneuvers that heavier fighters could not match. Against bombers flying in defensive formation, these advantages became irrelevant because the engagement took place in the brief seconds of a firing pass rather than an extended maneuvering combat. The bomber pilots never tried to outfly the fighters. They simply maintained formation, turned into attacks to spoil firing solutions, and trusted their gunners to make the enemy pay for every approach. American intelligence officers, studying combat reports, identified patterns that informed new tactical recommendations. SBD formations should maintain tight spacing to maximize overlapping defensive fire. Individual bombers under attack should turn toward the enemy rather than attempting evasion turns away, which exposed a vulnerable belly and offered easier shooting. Rear gunners should hold fire until enemy fighters closed inside 400 yards, where bullet density remained high enough to guarantee hits rather than wasting ammunition on low-probability shots at extended range. Formation leaders should maintain moderate speed rather than attempting to outrun fighters, because slower speeds improve turning performance and reduce the relative speed advantage of attacking fighters. These recommendations spread through operational squadrons via training documents and word of mouth, transforming the SBD from vulnerable target to dangerous adversary. The Japanese response to bomber defensive tactics followed a different path because their strategic situation prevented adaptation. As American offensives gained momentum through 1943, Japanese carrier air groups suffered attrition that could not be replaced quickly. Experienced pilots who understood bomber formation tactics died in combat or withdrew due to wounds. New pilots received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages, material shortages, and time pressure. The Navy could not afford extended training cycles that produced elite aviators when it needed immediate replacements for operational losses. These replacement pilots flew Zeros that retained the same performance. characteristics as earlier models, but lacked the pilot skill to exploit them. They attacked bomber formations using straightforward approaches that experienced gunners easily defeated. Casualties mounted, training time decreased further, and the quality spiral accelerated downward. By mid-1943, the balance had shifted decisively. American fighter escorts routinely accompanied bomber strikes, forcing Zeros to engage F-6F Hellcats or F-4U Corsairs before reaching the bombers. These new American fighters possessed sufficient power to dictate engagement terms, choosing when and where to fight rather than being forced into turning combat where the Zeros' maneuverability mattered. The few Zeros that penetrated the escort screen faced bomber formations defended by increasingly experienced gunners, who knew exactly how to exploit Japanese tactical patterns. SBD crews accumulated air-to-air victories at rates that would have seemed impossible in 1941. Official credits totaled 138 aerial victories for the Dauntless, with 107 being fighters. Most historians believe actual numbers were lower due to overlapping claims and combat confusion. But even conservative estimates show the dive bomber destroying dozens of fighters under conditions where conventional wisdom predicted the fighters would annihilate the bombers. The tactical relationship between the Zero and the Dauntless demonstrated that warfare success depends on the interaction between platform capabilities, tactical employment, and strategic context. The Zero represented an exquisite piece of engineering that maximized performance within carefully chosen constraints. It dominated early Pacific air combat because Japanese pilots used it correctly against opponents who could not counter its strengths. The Dauntless represented a more prosaic design that emphasized reliability and survivability over performance. It survived encounters with superior fighters because its crews developed tactics that neutralized performance advantages while exploiting structural and firepower strengths. Strategic context determined which approach succeeded in the long term. Japan needed to win quickly before American industrial capacity could build overwhelming force. The Zero served that strategy by enabling early victories. When the war extended beyond Japan's ability to replace losses and maintain elite pilot quality, the weaknesses inherent in the Zero's design became fatal. Lack of armor and self-sealing tanks meant that novice pilots died in aircraft that could not protect them. Lack of performance growth potential meant that the Zero stagnated while American fighters improved dramatically. The United States needed to survive early defeats while mobilizing industrial power that Japan could never match. The Dauntless served that strategy by allowing pilots of average skill to survive combat, learn from experience, and continue fighting. Its structural strength and defensive firepower kept casualties manageable during the desperate months of 1942 when trained crews could not be replaced quickly. As American production accelerated, the advantages of robust design multiplied because damaged aircraft could be repaired and returned to service rather than written off. Pilots who survived being shot down could train new aviators, and tactical lessons learned in combat could be documented and disseminated. The SBD proved adaptable enough to remain effective even after superior dive bombers like the SB-2 Sea Helldiver entered service, because experienced crews preferred its handling qualities and reliability to the newer aircraft's higher performance but more demanding flight characteristics. The individual encounter between 10 and 8 Dauntless bombers that could have occurred anywhere in the Pacific between 1942 and 1943 encapsulated these broader patterns. The Japanese pilot approached with justified confidence, based on his aircraft's performance specifications and his own training. The American pilots maintained formation because doctrine and experience taught them that mutual support provided better survival odds than dispersal. The Zero pilot selected his target adjusted his attack angle, and dove toward the trailing bomber. The SBD formation leader saw the enemy fighter and ordered a gentle turn into the attack, disrupting the Zero's approach geometry. The targeted pilot extended his dive brakes, slowed, and turned hard toward the Zero, forcing it to pass close aboard. The rear gunners and 3 separate bombers tracked the Zero through their sights and fired when it entered effective range. The Japanese pilot found his target disappearing from view as the Dauntless turned inside his fighter's turning circle at low speed. He rolled to follow, trying to bring his guns to bear, but the sustained turn cost him speed and altitude. Tracers from multiple bombers converged on his aircraft. Rounds punctured his wing, his fuselage, his unprotected fuel tanks. Gasoline mist erupted into flame when a bullet spark found oxygen. The Zero rolled inverted and fell away, trailing fire. The pilot might have survived to be picked up by a Japanese patrol boat if his parachute deployed. More likely, he rode the burning aircraft into the ocean because few Japanese aviators wore parachute harness straps tight enough to prevent separation during a high-speed bailout. And many pilots considered parachute use dishonorable anyway. The 8 Dauntless bombers continued toward their carrier, their rear gunners scanning the sky for additional threats, their pilots monitoring fuel gauges and mentally calculating whether they would reach the deck before tanks ran dry. This encounter never appeared in official records because no one bothered to file reports about such minor skirmishes. When they occurred multiple times weekly, historians cannot identify specific pilots or dates because the engagement typified routine combat rather than inevitable action. Yet thousands of similar encounters occurred throughout the Pacific War, each one testing whether Japanese performance advantages could overcome American tactical adaptation. The cumulative result of these minor combats determined which side controlled the airspace over carrier task forces, which side could execute strikes while suffering acceptable losses, which side maintained operational tempo despite attrition. The Zero won individual engagements frequently because it remained an excellent fighter when flown correctly. The Dauntless won the campaign because it enabled operational success, regardless of individual combat outcomes. The deeper lesson concerns how military institutions evaluate and respond to battlefield reality. The Imperial Japanese Navy recognized that Zero pilots struggled against defended bomber formations but could not alter the fundamental design compromise that made the Zero light and maneuverable at the cost of protection. Adding armor, self-sealing tanks, and more powerful radios would transform the Zero into a different aircraft with different performance characteristics, requiring complete redesign rather than field modification. The Navy initiated such redesign efforts with aircraft like the A-7M, but could not field them before war's end due to production disruptions and resource shortages. Meanwhile, existing Zeros continued flying missions with protection levels appropriate for 1937 air combat but suicidal in 1943. The United States Navy recognized that the SBD succeeded in combat roles beyond its original design intent and continued operating it long after superior dive bombers became available because experienced crews preferred the devil they knew. The Dauntless participated in combat operations through 1944 despite being obsolescent by numerical performance measures because it accomplished missions while bringing crews home alive. The encounter between individual Zeros and Dauntless formations illustrated asymmetric warfare principles that remain relevant decades after the last propeller fighter left service. Technological superiority provides advantages that matter only within specific tactical contexts. An opponent who refuses to fight on terms that favor superior technology can neutralize that advantage through alternative tactics. The side that adapts tactics to existing equipment faster than opponents can deploy new equipment wins regardless of specification comparisons. Survivability and reliability often contribute more to operational success than maximum performance because they enable learning, adaptation, and sustained operations. Crew quality and tactical doctrine can overcome platform limitations until the performance gap becomes so wide that no amount of skill suffices. But that threshold lies much farther out than most specifications suggest. For the Japanese pilot who attacked 8 American dive bombers somewhere over the Pacific Ocean without realizing the danger he faced. These principles remained academic right until the moment armor-piercing incendiary rounds began tearing through his unprotected aircraft. He died believing his fighter's performance assured victory, never understanding that performance alone determines nothing. The American crews who shot him down understood through hard experience that survival depends on mutual support, defensive firepower, and aircraft robust enough to absorb damage while still flying. They did not need the fastest aircraft or the most maneuverable or the longest ranged. They needed something that worked, that they understood completely, and that brought them home after they completed their mission. The Douglas SBD Dauntless delivered that capability reliably enough to earn a reputation as the aircraft that won Midway, the bomber that sank more Japanese shipping than any other type, and the machine that proved dive bombers could defeat interceptors under conditions where every rational analysis predicted otherwise. The Zero continued flying combat missions until August 1945, increasingly relegated to kamikaze attacks, where pilot survival became irrelevant and the aircraft's light construction actually benefited the mission by maximizing explosive payload capacity. The Dauntless retired from frontline service in 1944, replaced by the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver that offered better performance in every measurable category, while retaining none of the docile handling that made the SBD so beloved by its crews. Neither aircraft survives in significant numbers today. A handful of restored Zeros fly at air shows, maintained by teams of specialists who source scarce parts and reverse engineer long-lost manufacturing techniques. Even fewer airworthy SBDs remain operational, with perhaps 4 or 5 examples capable of flight worldwide. Museums preserve both types as static exhibits, mute testimony to desperate years when men flew fragile machines into lethal combat armed with courage, training, and imperfect weapons. The history books remember the Zero as the fighter that dominated the Pacific until American technology caught up, the symbol of Japanese air power during their period of maximum expansion. They remember the Dauntless as the bomber that sank 4 carriers at Midway in 5 minutes, turning the tide of the Pacific War through accurate bombing at a crucial moment. Both narratives contain truth, but miss the subtler lesson about how these aircraft interacted in the thousands of combat encounters that never made headlines. The Zero proved that brilliant engineering could produce an aircraft that exceeded every specification through radical design choices and careful weight management. The Dauntless proved that solid engineering could produce an aircraft that accomplished its mission despite mediocre specifications through robust construction and careful operational employment. Which approach succeeds depends entirely on strategic context, tactical adaptation, and the specific circumstances of engagement. In the end, wars are won by the side that maintains combat capability until the enemy collapses rather than by the side that wins the most individual engagements. The Zero won countless individual combats throughout the Pacific War but could not prevent eventual Japanese defeat because each victory depleted irreplaceable resources faster than they could be regenerated. The Dauntless lost many individual combats throughout the Pacific War but contributed to eventual American victory because each mission, successful or failed, taught lessons that informed the next mission while the robust aircraft and survivable crews continued operations despite losses. The mathematics seemed paradoxical but proved inexorable. The superior fighter lost the campaign while the inferior bomber helped win it, because war measures aggregate outcomes rather than peak performance. The moment a zero pilot decided to attack a formation of dauntless bombers, he committed himself to a tactical equation that had already been solved by physics and experience, though he might not recognize it until too late. Consider the geometry. The zero approaches from astern and above at 300 knots, diving to convert altitude into speed. The target formation consists of 8 SBDs flying at 140 knots in a loose VOVs arrangement, each bomber separated by enough distance to prevent mid-air collision, but close enough that their rear gunners can provide mutual fire support. The zero pilot must choose a single target, line up his attack close to gun range, fire a burst, and break away before the target's defensive fire or other gunners in the formation score hits. He has perhaps 2 seconds of effective firing time if everything proceeds perfectly. The attack geometry becomes more complex when examined from the bomber crew's perspective. 8 radio man gunners sit facing rearward in their cockpits, each scanning a sector of sky behind and to the sides of the formation. They spot the zero immediately when it begins its attack dive because the fighter creates a visible contrail in high altitude air, or because its polished metal surfaces reflect sunlight, or simply because 8 pairs of eyes searching for threats will find any aircraft that enters their collective field of view. The gunners communicate via interphone to their pilots, who begin a coordinated defensive maneuver. The formation turns gently toward the attacking zero, reducing its angle off and forcing it to adjust its approach. This turn costs the zero precious seconds as its pilot recalculates deflection and dive angle. More critically, the turn positions multiple bombers so that their rear guns can bear on the attacker. What began as a 1 versus 1 engagement becomes 1 versus 3 or 1 versus 4, with the zero exposed to multiple streams of tracer fire from different angles. The ammunition loads tell part of the story. Each SBD rear gunner has approximately 2,000 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition and twin flexible guns. The combined defensive armament of 8 bombers totals 16,000 rounds available for engagement. The zero carries 120 rounds per cannon and 600 rounds per machine gun, roughly 1,340 rounds total. But the zero must conserve ammunition across multiple engagements during a long combat air patrol, whereas the bomber gunners can expend freely because they face a single attack and will return to the carrier immediately after. The psychological advantage belongs to the defenders. They can spray the entire sky with bullets without worrying about running dry, while the attacker must carefully ration shots across multiple targets throughout the patrol. The structural comparison reveals why defensive fire proves so effective. The Zero's aluminum structure, optimized for minimum weight, could not absorb bullet impacts without critical damage. A .30 caliber round striking the wing spar might crack it enough to fail under maneuvering loads. A hit to the engine's unprotected cylinders would reduce power or cause seizure. Punctured fuel tanks sprayed gasoline into the slipstream, where any spark from bullet friction or electrical systems would ignite it catastrophically. The Zero possessed no fire suppression system beyond hoping the fire extinguished itself, which happened rarely once fuel fires started. Pilots knew that smoking Zero aircraft rarely returned to base because fire consumed the entire tail section before the pilot could react. The Dauntless absorbed heads differently because its structure incorporated safety margins that the Zero had deliberately eliminated. The wing spars use thicker aluminum with wider spacing between ribs, distributing loads across more structure. The engine's radial configuration meant that 1 or 2 damaged cylinders still left 7 operational, enough to maintain flight. Self-sealing fuel tanks, when hit, contracted around the puncture as gasoline reacted with chemicals in the tank wall material, limiting leakage to minor seeps rather than gushing streams. The fuel system included shutoff valves between tanks so that a punctured tank could be isolated. The robust airframe meant that battle damage causing catastrophic structural failure in a zero might only produce handling degradation in the Dauntless, allowing the pilot to retain control. All the way back to the carrier dot, these material advantages translated into tactical confidence. SBD crews knew their aircraft could survive hits that would destroy enemy fighters. This knowledge allowed them to fly predictable defensive patterns, rather than engaging in violent evasion that broke formation cohesion. The bomber formations maintained tight spacing, specifically because staying together offered better survival odds than scattering. A Zero pilot watching the formation hold together despite his attacks faced a psychologically disheartening realization: his best shots, his most aggressive approaches, his expenditure of precious ammunition achieved nothing decisive. The bombers continued flying, continued defending, continued progressing toward their carrier. He could shoot down stragglers if any fell behind. But the core formation remained intact and would deliver its intelligence about Japanese fleet positions regardless of his efforts. The training background of the opposing pilots shaped how these engagements unfolded. Japanese naval aviators graduated from multi-year training pipelines that emphasized dogfighting skills above all other qualities. They practiced aerobatic maneuvers until they could perform them instinctively in combat stress. They learned to judge lead angles for deflection shooting at various target speeds and approach geometries. They studied pursuit curves and turn circles and energy management with academic rigor. This training produced pilots who could defeat any Allied fighter through pure flying skill during the early war period. But it did not prepare them for targets that refused to dogfight, that absorbed hits and kept flying, that concentrated defensive fire into unavoidable kill zones. The Japanese training establishment had no institutional knowledge of how to defeat defended bomber formations, because Japan had never faced such targets before 1942. American naval aviators received shorter training focused on fundamental flying skills and basic combat maneuvers. The Navy needed pilots quickly and could not afford 3-year training cycles. SBD pilots learned dive bombing techniques, navigation, carrier landings, and formation flying. They practiced defensive maneuvers against simulated fighter attacks, learning to turn into attacks and maintain formation integrity. Rear gunners trained extensively on the flexible guns, learning to track fast-moving targets and fire short bursts rather than long, wasteful streams. Neither pilot nor gunner became virtuosos in their craft, but both learned to execute basic techniques reliably under stress. This training produced adequate crews who improved through combat experience. If they survived the early engagements, the experience accumulation patterns favored the Americans, because their aircraft brought damaged crews home more reliably. A Zero pilot who survived being shot down in the ocean could be rescued by Japanese patrol boats or submarines if they found him quickly. But the vast distances of the Pacific meant that rescue remained unlikely unless the combat occurred very close to Japanese bases. A Zero pilot who stayed with his damaged fighter as it burned or broke up usually died in the resulting crash or drowned after ditching. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost not just aircraft but irreplaceable pilot experience every time a Zero went down. The Americans operated closer to their bases during offensive operations, deployed better rescue submarines and floatplanes, and issued life rafts and radio beacons to downed aviators. They also flew aircraft like the Dauntless that could absorb battle damage and still make it back to friendly forces. The result was that American aviators survived being shot down at high rates, returned to operational units after rescue, and accumulated combat experience that made them more effective in subsequent Engagements. The strategic implications of these tactical patterns became clear. During the Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 through February 1943, Japanese forces held Henderson Field on Guadalcanal Island and used it to attack American shipping supporting marine positions. American carrier task forces operated in the surrounding waters to contest control of the airspace and prevent Japanese reinforcement convoys from reaching the island. The campaign produced a grinding series of air battles where Japanese fighters from Rabaul faced American fighters and bombers from Henderson Field and from carriers. The Zero pilots entered the campaign with superior training and better aircraft, but they operated at the extreme range of their aircraft's capability while the Americans fought over friendly territory where rescue was nearly certain. 6 months of constant combat killed most of the experienced Japanese pilots, and their replacements arrived with progressively less training as Japan struggled to maintain aviator output despite instructor losses. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the ultimate consequence of these attrition patterns. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled its remaining carrier air groups for a decisive strike against American forces invading the Mariana Islands. The Japanese launched massive raids comprising hundreds of aircraft, confident that weight of numbers would overcome any American defensive advantages. American combat air patrols intercepted the raids far from the carriers, using F-6F Hellcat fighters that possessed sufficient performance to dictate engagement terms. The Hellcats slaughtered the Japanese formations in combats that American pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 300 Japanese aircraft fell in a single day for the loss of approximately 30 American aircraft. The disparity resulted from American pilots with extensive combat experience and excellent aircraft fighting Japanese pilots with minimal training and Zeros that could no longer compete against current-generation American fighters. The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen faced intensive anti-aircraft fire from American ships, and the remaining bombers encountered defending fighters before they could attack. The entire Japanese strike accomplished almost nothing, while losing most of its aircraft and pilots. This outcome traced directly to the accumulated effects of thousands of minor engagements fought between 1942 and 1944, including countless encounters between Zeros and Dauntless formations where the bomber crews survived to fight again while Zero pilots died or withdrew from combat with battle fatigue. Each engagement where an SBD formation shot down a Zero represented not just one destroyed aircraft, but the loss of a trained pilot whose experience could never be replaced quickly enough to matter. Each engagement where the Dauntless absorbed damage and returned home represented preserved experience that made those crews more dangerous in their next mission. The Zero remained an excellent aircraft design throughout the war, but the tactical conditions of Pacific combat prevented it from exploiting its performance advantages while exposing its structural vulnerabilities to opponents who learned how to survive against it. The industrial context amplified these patterns because American production capacity vastly exceeded Japan's ability to build aircraft or train pilots. Douglas manufactured 5,836 SBD Dauntless bombers between 1940 and 1944, enough to equip every carrier squadron with modern dive bombers while maintaining reserves for training and attrition replacement. Mitsubishi produced approximately 10,000 Zeros across all variants during the same period, a respectable total, but insufficient to maintain numerical parity against American production of all aircraft types. More critically, American production quality remained consistent throughout the war because industrial workers had access to necessary materials and did not face strategic bombing of their factories. Japanese production quality declined after 1943 as shortages of aluminum, gasoline, rubber, and skilled workers forced manufacturers to use substitute materials and abbreviated quality control procedures. Late war Zeros suffered from these compromises, developing engine problems and structural failures at higher rates than early production aircraft. The pilot training differential became even more pronounced as Japan exhausted its petroleum reserves. Flying training consumes vast quantities of aviation gasoline because epaulets must accumulate hundreds of hours in the aircraft before becoming combat ready. Pre-war Japanese training programs assigned trainees to operational aircraft types for extended flying hours, building the muscle memory and instinctive reactions that characterized elite pilots. By 1944, fuel shortages forced the Navy to drastically reduce flight time in training programs, substituting ground school lectures and simulator practice for actual flying. Pilots arrived at operational units with minimal stick time and no experience with combat maneuvers beyond textbook descriptions. These replacement pilots flew their first combat missions against American aviators who had survived multiple tours, knew every nuance of their aircraft, and could execute complex tactics instinctively. The predictable result was a slaughter that Japan could not prevent because it lacked the resources to train pilots properly. The Dauntless itself became obsolescent by 1944, not because its capabilities deteriorated, but because American industry had developed superior dive bombers like the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver that offered better performance in every category. The Helldiver carried heavier bomb loads, farther and faster than the Dauntless, while incorporating lessons learned from 3 years of Pacific combat. It featured folding wings for compact carrier storage, more powerful engines, and improved defensive armament. The Navy officially replaced the SBD with the SB-2C in frontline squadrons during 1944, relegating the older aircraft to training duties and secondary missions. Yet many pilots and squadrons preferred to continue operating the Dauntless despite its obsolescence because they trusted its reliability and understood its handling characteristics completely. The SB-2C earned the nickname Beast for its difficult handling characteristics and maintenance problems, whereas the SBD had earned nicknames like Slow but Deadly that acknowledged its limitations while respecting its combat. Record. This preference for familiar equipment over superior specifications reflected a deeper truth about combat effectiveness. An aircraft is only as good as the crew's ability to employ it under stress. The Dauntless had been refined through years of operational use, until pilots understood exactly how it would respond in every situation. They knew its stall characteristics, its control feel at various speeds, its glide ratio with different damage configurations. This intuitive knowledge allowed them to fly the aircraft to its absolute limits during combat without exceeding those limits and losing control. The Helldiver offered better specifications, but required learning new handling characteristics and adapting tactics to different performance envelopes. Many squadrons concluded that the combat advantage of flying familiar aircraft outweighed the performance benefits of transitioning to new types, at least during intense operational periods when training time was scarce. The Zero faced similar obsolescence by 1944, but could not be replaced, effectively because Japan had not developed a clear successor design that entered mass production before war's end. The A7M Repu represented an attempt to create a Zero successor with higher performance and better protection, but development delays and production difficulties meant that only prototype quantities were built. The J2M Raiden offered excellent high-altitude performance for intercepting B-29 bombers, but proved unsuitable for carrier operations due to poor low-speed handling. Various other designs entered development but never reached squadrons in meaningful numbers. The Navy continued operating Zeros throughout 1945, not from choice, but from necessity, because no alternative existed in sufficient quantity. This meant the Japanese pilots flew obsolete aircraft against current American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, which could outperform the Zero in every category except low-speed turning radius. The final months of the Pacific War saw Zeros relegated primarily to kamikaze attacks, where the pilot's survival became irrelevant and the aircraft served simply as a guided missile. This role actually suited the Zero better than conventional air combat because its light construction maximized the explosive payload it could carry, while its long range allowed attacks from distant bases. The lack of armor and self-sealing tanks became irrelevant when the pilot intended to crash anyway. Approximately 2,300 kamikaze attacks were launched between October 1944 and August 1945, with Zeros representing a significant portion of the aircraft used. These attacks sank dozens of American ships and damaged hundreds more, achieving more material success than conventional strikes could have accomplished with the same resources. Yet they represented the ultimate admission of defeat. Japan had lost the ability to contest American naval power through conventional means and resorted to suicide attacks as the only way to inflict significant casualties. The contrast with American naval aviation could not have been more stark. By mid-1945, American carrier task forces operated with impunity within sight of the Japanese home islands, launching strikes against targets throughout Japan while Japanese air forces proved unable to mount effective resistance. American pilots flew aircraft like the F-4U Corsair and F-6F Hellcat that dominated Japanese fighters so completely that most combat losses came from anti-aircraft fire rather than aerial combat. American bombers, including the remaining SBD Dauntlesses, in secondary roles, attacked Japanese shipping and installations with minimal opposition. The pilots flying these missions represented the survivors of 3 years of intense combat, the beneficiaries of extensive training programs, and the operators of combat-proven equipment that had been refined through continuous improvement based on battle experience. The story that began with a Zero pilot attacking 8 Dauntless bombers somewhere over the Pacific in 1942 or 1943, thus, connects to the broader narrative of the Pacific War's outcome. That individual engagement encapsulated the tactical patterns that determined which side would accumulate combat power faster than the other could attrit it. The Zero pilot believed his aircraft's performance advantages ensured victory, but he fought under tactical conditions where those advantages proved largely irrelevant while his aircraft's vulnerabilities remained deadly. The Dauntless crews understood their limitations, but employed tactics that neutralized enemy strengths while exploiting their own advantages in structural durability and defensive firepower. Neither aircraft won the Pacific War by itself, but the aggregated outcomes of thousands of small engagements between these aircraft and their crews tilted the balance progressively toward American victory. The technological lesson speaks to how militaries should evaluate weapon systems and operational concepts. Raw performance specifications matter, but they matter only within the tactical context where combat actually occurs. An aircraft optimized for one type of engagement may prove helpless in different circumstances despite superior specifications. The Zero dominated turning dogfights, but struggled against defended formations and high-speed slashing attacks. The Dauntless couldn't win dogfights, but excelled at surviving attacks and delivering ordnance on target. Which aircraft proved more valuable depended entirely on what the war required them to do. Japan needed to win quickly through decisive engagements where elite pilots in superior fighters would annihilate American forces before industrial production could tip the balance. That strategy required aircraft like the Zero America needed to survive early defeats while mobilizing production capacity that Japan could never match, which required aircraft like the Dauntless that kept crews alive long enough to learn combat skills and that could be produced in vast numbers. The human lesson concerns how organizations develop and maintain expertise under pressure. The Imperial Japanese Navy invested tremendous resources in creating elite aviators through multi-year training programs, producing pilots of exceptional individual capability. This approach worked brilliantly when combat losses remained low and experienced pilots could mentor newcomers while sharing tactical knowledge. It failed catastrophically when attrition exceeded replacement capacity because the training system could not adapt quickly to produce adequate pilots in larger numbers. The U.S. Navy created a training system that produced competent aviators in adequate numbers through abbreviated programs, accepting lower individual capability in exchange for higher output. This approach meant that early wartime American pilots were outclassed by their Japanese opponents. But the system could scale to produce thousands of pilots annually while incorporating combat lessons into training curricula. The American approach proved superior in a long war because it treated pilots as a renewable resource that could be replaced and improved continuously. The institutional lesson addresses how military organizations learn from combat experience. The Imperial Japanese Navy recognized that Zero pilots struggled against defended bomber formations, but treated this as a pilot proficiency problem rather than a systemic issue requiring new aircraft designs or different tactics. The assumption was that better training and more aggressive attacks would overcome bomber defenses. So the Navy continued operating Zeros with minimal modifications while attempting to improve pilot quality. This approach failed because the problem was not individual pilot skill, but the mismatch between aircraft capabilities and tactical requirements. American pilots in inferior aircraft could neutralize Zero performance advantages through formation, tactics, and defensive fire because the Zero structural vulnerability made it fragile under any hits. No amount of Japanese pilot skill could overcome that fundamental design reality. The United States Navy recognized that the Dauntless succeeded in roles beyond its original design intent and adapted operational doctrine to exploit these capabilities. SBD formations became standard defensive tactics. Rear gunner training emphasized the specific techniques that proved effective in combat. Dive bombing accuracy improved as pilots refined techniques based on battle damage assessments. The Navy treated the Dauntless as a learning platform that could be improved through operational refinement, even without modifying the basic aircraft. This approach maximized the value extracted from existing equipment while allowing time for superior replacements to be developed and fielded. The institutional culture emphasized learning from experience and adapting tactics to reality, rather than expecting reality to conform to pre-war doctrine. These institutional differences reflected broader cultural patterns in how Japan and America approached warfare. Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual qualities, like fighting spirit and devotion to duty, as decisive factors that could overcome material disadvantages. The assumption was that superior morale and dedication would allow Japanese forces to defeat better-equipped enemies through sheer determination. This worldview led to tactical decisions like emphasizing offensive operations regardless of casualties, accepting higher loss rates in exchange for temporary advantages, and refusing to adapt tactics that had succeeded previously, even when circumstances changed. The Zero embodied this philosophy through its emphasis on performance at the cost of protection, reflecting the belief that Japanese pilots would destroy enemies before being hit themselves. American military culture emphasized industrial production, technological innovation, and systematic problem-solving as decisive factors that would overwhelm enemy forces through material superiority. The assumption was that adequate equipment produced in overwhelming quantities and operated by competent, Personnel would eventually defeat any opponent, regardless of individual skill advantages. This worldview led to tactical decisions like accepting temporary defeats while mobilizing production, prioritizing pilot survival over maximum combat performance, and continuously refining both equipment and tactics based on battle experience. The Dauntless embodied this philosophy through its emphasis on durability and reliability at the cost of maximum performance, reflecting the belief that wars are won by the side that maintains operational capability longest. Neither philosophy was inherently superior, but the Pacific War's duration and geographic scope favored the American approach. A short war fought close to Japanese bases might have validated the Japanese emphasis on elite pilots in high-performance aircraft, because individual superiority could be decisive in brief campaigns. The actual war lasted 4 years,